Ruth and her husband Henry had just returned from their wedding ceremony. They were filled with joy, laughter, and excitement. As they sat together, they decided to unwrap the gifts they'd received from their friends and family, eager to see the surprises inside. One by one, they opened each package, reading the congratulatory messages and smiling at the thoughtful gifts. Then, a peculiar gift caught their attention. It was wrapped with a beautiful, shimmering golden paper, but had no name or message on it. "Who would send us something without a note?" Henry asked, raising an eyebrow. They slowly unwrapped the mysterious gift, and inside was a mirror with a fancy golden frame, intricate and eye-catching. "I love this mirror," Ruth exclaimed, her eyes shining with delight. But Henry wasn't as sure. "Who would give us a mirror as a wedding gift?" he asked, feeling a little uneasy and with no name or message. "That's strange." Ruth, however, was captivated. She gently lifted the mirror and said, "I think it'll look lovely in the living room." She hung it on the wall, standing back to admire how it sparkled in the light. But something felt a bit off to Henry. "Are you sure about this mirror, Ruth?" he asked, still feeling a bit uneasy. "It seems different." "Oh, it's fine, it's unique," Ruth replied, brushing off his concerns. But just then, she got an idea. "Actually, maybe it would be better in our bedroom," she said. She carefully carried the mirror and mounted it on the wall of their bedroom, adjusting it until it looked perfect. As she left the room to join Henry to finish unwrapping the other gifts, a thin, dark smoke began swirling inside the mirror's glass, almost as if it were alive. The smoke twisted and turned, forming shapes twisting and curling in the air like a snake. From that day on, things began to change. Shadows moved where there should have been none, and strange noises filled the quiet house at night. After a joyful evening of unwrapping gifts and sharing laughs, Ruth and Henry finally lay down on their new, cozy bed in their bedroom. They made love, then whispered sweet things to each other, holding hands, and eventually drifted off to sleep, happy and content. In the early morning light, Ruth opened her eyes, smiling as she remembered the night before. "Good morning, honey," she greeted, stretching. Henry turned to her, grinning, but before he could say anything, Ruth said with a playful look, "Honey, the style you gave me in the middle of the night was amazing. I've never felt like that before. This is the best love I have ever had." Henry's smile faded. "What are you talking about?" he asked, looking confused. "I didn't wake up in the middle of the night. I slept straight through." Ruth laughed, nudging him. "Oh, come on, don't be shy. I'm talking about how you lifted my legs and, gave me those different styles all night," she said with a grin. Henry's face grew serious. "Ruth, I really don't know what you're talking about. I never woke up last night." The room went silent. Ruth's smile faded as she looked into Henry's eyes, realizing he wasn't joking. Just then, a loud knock at the front door broke the silence, making them both jump. Ruth got up, her heart pounding a little faster than usual, and went to answer the door. When she opened it, she saw her younger stepsister Ella standing there with her luggage. "Good morning," Ella greeted cheerfully, giving Ruth a hug. "Mama said I should come early so I can help you with the morning chores." "Oh, Ella, you're here already. Isn't it a bit too early?" Ruth asked, glancing back at Henry, who was still sitting up in bed, looking deep in thought. "No, Mama insisted I leave early," Ella replied. "She thought I could get a head start and settle in. She said it's only polite to help you since I'll be staying here for a while." Ruth gave a small, uneasy smile, trying to shake off the strange feeling from moments before. She helped Ella carry her luggage inside, showing her to the guest room. As they settled Ella in, Ruth couldn't stop thinking about what Henry had said. If he wasn't with her in the middle of the night, who or what was? Months passed, and Ruth discovered she was pregnant. The news filled the house with joy. Ruth's husband, Henry, was especially excited, dreaming of becoming a father. They both prepared eagerly, imagining their little one's arrival. Each day felt brighter, and their happiness grew. Then one night, as they lay sleeping in their cozy bed, something strange happened. In the quiet, a dark, misty smoke began to swirl out of the mirror in their bedroom. Slowly, the smoke thickened and twisted, forming a shadowy figure, a monster with dark eyes and a terrifying grin. It stepped out of the mirror and walked up to Ruth as she lay sound asleep, too deep in her dreams to notice the strange visitor. The shadowy creature leaned over her, and she felt something strange, but she was too weak and sleepy to wake up fully. Half asleep, she thought it was Henry, so She drifted back to sleep, thinking everything was okay. Suddenly, she jolted awake in the early morning light. She felt strange and weak, and as she looked down, her eyes widened in horror. There was blood all over the bed. Ruth let out a scream that echoed through the room, waking Henry up. He sat up quickly, his face filled with shock and worry. "Henry? Ruth? What happened?" he asked, rushing to her side. But Ruth was crying, too shaken to explain. Henry, alarmed, shouted for help, and Ella, Ruth's stepsister, ran into the room. Together, they helped Ruth out of bed and hurried her to the hospital. There, after a long wait, the doctor finally came out, his face heavy with sad news. He explained that Ruth had lost the baby. Ruth broke into tears, her heart shattered, and Henry held her tightly, his own eyes filled with sorrow. As they returned home, Ruth's sadness quickly turned to anger. She looked at Henry, her eyes blazing. "Why did you do this to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Henry looked confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. "You know what I mean," Ruth replied. "You came to me in the middle of the night. I thought it was you. But now I feel like you hurt me somehow." Henry was shocked. "Ruth, I swear I didn't wake up last night. I don't know what happened." But Ruth didn't believe him. Her heart was too heavy, and her mind was full of questions. She blamed Henry, and he couldn't seem to prove his innocence. This strange event kept happening. Each time Ruth became pregnant, something terrible would happen in the night. She'd feel a presence near her, but she was too weak to wake up fully. Each time she would lose the baby, and each time she would ask Henry, "Why do you keep doing this?" But Henry would look at her with sadness and insist, "It wasn't me, Ruth. I promise." The mysterious losses began to strain their marriage. Henry tried to comfort Ruth, but she couldn't trust him. And in the corner of the room, the mirror stood silently, as if it were hiding a terrible secret. A golden frame now looking less beautiful and more haunting, their love and trust slowly crumbled as they kept wondering. One day, Ruth found out she was pregnant again. She and Henry were overjoyed, but this time they felt afraid too. They didn't want to lose another baby, so Henry came up with an idea. "I'll sleep in a different room," he said, holding Ruth's hands. "This way nothing strange can happen. I'll check on you every morning to make sure you're safe." Ruth agreed, though she felt nervous about sleeping alone. She took a deep breath and hoped that this time everything would be okay. One quiet night, Ruth lay sleeping peacefully, her heart filled with hope for her little baby. But then a thick, dark smoke began to slip out of the mirror's golden frame, twisting and curling in the air like a snake. The room grew colder as the smoke turned into a shadowy figure, slowly creeping toward Ruth as she lay in bed. In her sleep, Ruth felt something strange, a heavy weight beside her, a feeling that someone was there. She felt someone touching her, but her body felt so weak she could barely move. She tried to call out, but her voice was caught in her throat. She thought it must be a nightmare, but just then she snapped awake, gasping for air. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. When she looked down, her eyes filled with horror. There was blood all over the bed. She screamed, the sound echoing through the house. Her hands shook as she looked around, realizing the room was locked, and she was all alone. Who was in here? She whispered to herself, fear gripping her heart. She had no idea who or what had been with her. Hearing her scream, Henry and Ella rushed down the hallway. Ruth, still shaking, managed to unlock the door, her hands trembling. When Henry and Ella saw her, covered in blood, their faces turned pale with shock. Henry knelt beside her, holding her hand. "Ruth, what happened?" "I wasn't here. The door was locked." "Who could have done this?" Ruth looked into his eyes, unable to answer, as fear filled her heart. Ella held Ruth's other hand, whispering, "This is not normal. Something strange is happening." The next morning, Ruth felt scared and worried. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew something was very wrong. Her little sister Ella could see how sad Ruth was, so she took her hand and whispered, "Ruth, maybe we should call Mama. She always knows what to do." Ruth nodded, and soon she was talking to her stepmother, Mrs. Agnes, on the phone. Mrs. Agnes had loved Ruth like her own daughter, ever since Ruth's mother passed away. She listened carefully as Ruth explained everything. "Oh, my dear Ruth," Mrs. Agnes said in a gentle, calming voice. "Don't worry, my child. We'll find a way to make it all better. Come to my house tomorrow morning. I know someone who can help us." Early the next morning, Ruth and her husband Henry got ready and drove to Mrs. Agnes's house. The sun was shining, but Ruth couldn't shake the nervous feeling in her heart. When they arrived, Mrs. Agnes welcomed them warmly, giving Ruth a big, comforting hug. She looked at Ruth with kind eyes and said, "We're going to visit a very special lady today. She's a prophetess, and she knows how to deal with things that are unusual." Ruth and Henry exchanged glances, not quite sure what to expect, but they trusted Mrs. Agnes. Together they walked to the small, quiet house of the prophetess, deep in the village. The house was surrounded by tall trees, and the air felt heavy, like it was filled with secrets. Inside, the prophetess was waiting for them. She was an older woman with a wise face, wearing a long, flowing robe. She looked deeply into Ruth's eyes, as if she could see all the strange things that had been happening. Without a word, she nodded and gestured for them to sit. Then she closed her eyes and began to pray, her voice strong and steady. As she prayed, the air in the room seemed to thicken, and Ruth felt a chill run down her spine. She squeezed Henry's hand, feeling safe by his side, but then the prophetess opened her eyes and spoke softly, her voice filled with mystery. "Ruth," she said, "you have been connecting to a water spirit, a powerful spirit from the deep waters. It has been following you and causing these strange things. We must do a special prayer to set you free from it." Henry's face turned pale. He held Ruth's hand tightly and said, "Please do whatever you need to help her." The prophetess looked at him and shook her head. "I'm sorry, young man. For this prayer only women can stay. You must go home and Ruth will stay here with us. Do not worry, we will keep her safe." Henry didn't want to leave, but he knew he had no choice. He kissed Ruth's hand and whispered, "I'll be back in the morning. Be brave." After he left, Ruth felt a little nervous, but her stepmother, Mrs. Agnes, held her hand. The prophetess began to prepare for the night, lighting candles and sprinkling water around the room. The flickering light cast strange shadows on the walls, making everything look mysterious and a little spooky. Late at night, just as the world was dark and quiet, the prophetess told Ruth to come to her shrine. The room was dimly lit, with candles flickering and casting strange shadows on the walls. It was quiet, except for the prophetess's soft, powerful voice as she began to pray. "Ruth, put this on," the prophetess whispered, handing her a long white gown. It felt strange and heavy as Ruth slipped it over her head, feeling the cool fabric against her skin. She looked around, feeling nervous but hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the answer she had been searching for. The prayer went on and on, the prophetess's voice growing louder, echoing off the walls. Then, an hour later, she brought out a thick rope and tied Ruth's hands together. Ruth looked down, her heart pounding. Why was this happening? "Stay strong, child," the prophetess said, her voice almost like a warning. She pulled out 3 large sticks and lifted them high. Suddenly, with a loud crack, she struck Ruth's back. Ruth gasped in pain, tears filling her eyes. She wanted to run, to escape, but the prophetess's voice echoed in her ears. "This is the only way, Ruth. This will drive the spirits away." The beating continued, each strike feeling sharper and heavier. Ruth cried, but she didn't try to stop it. She closed her eyes tightly, praying that this would be the end of her troubles, that after tonight she could finally be free. When morning came, Ruth returned home, her body bruised, her heart heavy. Henry took one look at her and saw the red swollen marks across her arms and back. Tears filled his eyes and he held her close as they both cried. It felt as if all the sadness in the world had gathered around them. But Ruth took a deep breath and whispered, "It is over now, Henry. The prophetess said so. This time, it has to be over." Months passed and Ruth's heart slowly began to feel lighter. One day she felt a flutter in her stomach. She was pregnant. This time she dared to hope. Each day her tummy grew a little bigger and the house was filled with laughter and joy. Henry and Ruth talked about baby names, imagining their little bundle of joy. Even Ella helped, doing all the chores so Ruth wouldn't have to lift a finger. When Ruth reached 5 months, Henry decided to throw a celebration. It was the first time she had carried a baby this long, and he wanted to every moment. Friends and family gathered, the house filled with laughter, music, and the smell of delicious food. For the first time in a long time, Ruth felt truly happy. That night, after everyone had left, Ruth and Henry went to bed, smiling and holding hands. But as they drifted into a deep sleep, something strange happened. The mirror in their room shimmered, and out of it a dark figure crept into the room. It was the same monster that had haunted her dreams before. It moved silently toward Ruth, its shadow looming over her as she lay sleeping. In her dream, Ruth felt the monster's cold touch and she screamed. She awoke, her heart racing, only to see blood staining the sheets around her. Henry jumped up and they rushed to the hospital. But deep down, Ruth already knew what had happened. The baby was gone. Back at home, the house that had been so full of joy now felt empty. Ruth sat in silence, feeling as if the world had crumbled around her. The dream of holding her baby, of becoming a mother, felt more distant than ever. She didn't know if she could go through this again, and for the first time, she felt truly defeated. When Ruth came back from the hospital, her stepmother, Mrs. Agnes, came to stay with her to help her heal. Every day, Mrs. Agnes would sit with her, telling her to be patient and reminding her that things would get better. Ruth would listen, holding on to her stepmother's comforting words even though her heart felt so heavy. She wanted more than anything to believe that this sadness would end. One evening, as the sky turned dark and the house grew quiet, Mrs. Agnes called Ruth and Henry into the living room. Her voice was serious, and her face looked worried. "Ruth, Henry, I think it's time we tried something new. I know a very powerful man who might help us," she said. Henry was unsure, his face full of doubt, but Ruth looked at him with pleading eyes. She was desperate, willing to do anything just to finally hold her own baby. Reluctantly, Henry nodded, and they agreed to go. The next day they arrived at the native doctor's shrine. It was a strange place, filled with strange objects hanging from the walls, and the smell of burning herbs filled the air. The native doctor looked at them, his eyes dark and mysterious. He told Ruth that if she wanted to be free, she had to make sacrifices. "You must go to your village and bathe in the river at midnight," he said, his voice echoing in the room. Ruth felt a chill run down her spine, but she nodded. She was ready to do anything. That night, she travelled to her village alone, feeling both scared and determined. She stood by the river at midnight, under the moonlight, and did everything the native doctor had asked. She prayed, hoping that this would finally be the end of her pain. When she returned home, she felt hopeful, thinking maybe this time would be different. A few months later, Ruth discovered she was pregnant again. Her heart swelled with hope and joy, and she took extra care to protect her unborn child. But one night, just as she drifted off to sleep, the monster returned. It was there in her dream, dark and terrifying, and when she woke up, she knew something was wrong. Her heart sank as she realized she had lost the baby again. She felt broken, like all her dreams had crumbled into dust. This time, things changed. Henry, who had always been there for her, began to grow distant. He seemed frustrated, often avoiding her. One afternoon, Ruth walked into their bedroom and saw Henry packing clothes into his suitcase. She watched, confused, and asked, "Henry, are you going somewhere?" Henry didn't look at her. He sighed and replied, "No, I'm not traveling. I'm moving to the other room. I need my space, Ruth. I don't want to share a room anymore." His words hit her like a storm. Ruth felt her heart break as she watched him walk away. She wanted to reach out, to beg him to stay, but no words came. She just stood there, frozen, as Henry left the room. That night, Ruth lay alone in their bed, staring up at the ceiling with tears streaming down her face. She felt like everything in her life was falling apart. The emptiness surrounded her, and she cried until she drifted off to sleep, wondering if her life would ever be whole again. Days later, Ruth sat alone in the living room late at night, waiting for Henry to come home. She'd called him over and over, but he didn't answer. She felt worried and hurt, wondering where he could be. Finally, she heard the door creak open. There was Henry, stumbling in, smelling strongly of a strange perfume, and looking tired and drunk. "Where have you been, Henry? And why didn't you answer my calls?" Ruth asked, her voice filled with worry and anger. Henry just laughed a little, not looking at her. "Why are you calling me? Do you think I'm your baby?" he muttered, pushing past her. "I just want to go to bed." Ruth's heart sank, but she stepped in front of him, refusing to move. "No, Henry, you're my husband, and I deserve to know where you were," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Henry's eyes flashed with anger, and before she knew it, his hand shot out, slapping her hard across the face. Ruth stumbled back, her cheeks stinging, as Henry pushed past her without another word. She stood there in shock, tears streaming down her face, her heart shattered. Ella, who had been asleep, woke up to the sound of Ruth crying. She hurried over, wrapping her arms around Ruth, comforting her until she calmed down. That night, Ruth lay in bed, her heart heavy with sadness. She cried quietly, asking God for strength, wondering if things would ever get better. The next morning, Ruth couldn't bear the pain any longer. She packed a small bag and left, heading to her stepmother's house. Mrs. Agnes welcomed her with open arms, listening as Ruth told her everything. Mrs. Agnes was furious when she heard about Henry hitting Ruth. She called him, warning him that he should never lay a hand on Ruth again. Then she held Ruth, telling her to stay for a few days to rest and clear her mind. But even with her stepmother's comforting words, Ruth felt like a shadow of herself. Every night she prayed, pouring her heart out to God. "Please, God," she whispered, "I'm just an orphan. Please hear me. Please wipe away my tears." After a few days, Ruth decided to return to Henry's house. She missed him and hoped that maybe, just maybe, things could go back to normal. But when she got home, Henry didn't say a word to her. He didn't apologize, didn't hug her, didn't even look at her. Instead, he acted as if she wasn't there, giving her the cold shoulder. Ruth tried to talk to him, tried to remind him of their love, but he only shrugged her off. Late one night, feeling desperate, Ruth went to Henry's room. She sat on his bed, looking at him with pleading eyes. "Henry, please," she whispered, reaching out to him. "Let's try again. How can I get pregnant if you don't even touch me?" Henry looked at her, his face hard. "I'm tired, Ruth," he said. "Tired of all the hospital visits, the heartbreak, the losses. Just let me be." Ruth's heart ached, but she stayed there, hoping he would change his mind. But with a sigh, Henry grabbed a pillow, walked out of the room and left her sitting there, alone and heartbroken. One sunny afternoon, Ruth sat quietly in the living room, reading her Bible. She felt a little bit of peace as she read, hoping that maybe things would get better soon. Nearby, Ella was busy cleaning the house, humming softly as she dusted the shelves. Everything seemed calm, but suddenly Ella stopped. She started coughing hard, clutching her stomach. Then she dashed to the bathroom and started throwing up. Ruth's heart skipped a beat. She rushed over, knocking on the bathroom door. "Ella, are you okay?" Ruth's voice was full of worry. After a few moments, Ella came out, looking weak and pale. Ruth gently held her by the arm. "Ella, we need to go to the hospital. I don't want anything to happen to you," she said, her voice shaking. "You're my only sister, and I don't know what I'd do without you."
Without wasting a second, Ruth grabbed her car keys and helped Ella into the car.
She drove quickly, her heart pounding the whole way. At the hospital, they waited anxiously as the doctor ran tests. Ruth held Ella's hand, trying to stay calm. Finally, the doctor returned, holding a paper with a serious look on his face. "Ella, you're 2 months pregnant." Ruth's eyes widened and her heart sank. "Pregnant," she whispered. She felt confused, unsure what to think. Back at home, she looked at Ella, her mind racing. She had to know the truth. "Ella, who's the father?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Ella looked down, avoiding her sister's eyes. She hesitated, trying to find the right words. After a long silence, she finally confessed. It's Henry." Ruth's world seemed to crumble around her. She sank to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She thought she knew Ella, thought they had no secrets. But now this was too much. She felt both sad and betrayed. They sat together, both crying, their hearts heavy. After a while, they heard the door open. Henry was back from work. He looked at the two women sitting on the floor, confused. "What's going on? Why are you both crying? Did something happen?" Ruth stood up slowly, her face wet with tears. She walked toward Henry, her hands clenched into fists. She started pounding on his chest, sobbing. "You fool," she cried. "You've been sleeping with my sister, and now she's pregnant. How could you do this?" Henry's face turned pale. He dropped to his knees, his own tears beginning to fall. "I'm so sorry, Ruth. I didn't mean for this to happen. Please, please forgive me," he begged. But Ruth was too heartbroken. She turned away from him, feeling like her whole world had shattered. She went into the bedroom, grabbed a bag, and started packing her things. She felt numb, barely aware of what she was doing. As she walked out of the house, she looked back one last time, her heart heavy with sadness and betrayal. Without saying another word, she left, feeling like her heart had been torn into a million pieces. When Ruth got home, she felt broken. Her heart ached, and her tears seemed endless. She told her stepmother everything that had happened, how her own sister Ella was pregnant with her husband Henry's baby. Her stepmother, Mrs. Agnes, listened quietly, but her face grew serious and angry. She couldn't believe the betrayal and felt deeply disappointed. Mrs. Agnes called Henry and Ella over for a serious talk. She looked at both of them sternly, her eyes full of anger and sadness. She scolded them, saying, "What you both did is terrible. You have hurt Ruth and brought shame to our family." Her voice shook with disappointment. After a long pause, she said, "But what's done is done. No daughter of mine will have a baby in this house without being married. Henry, you must marry Ella, and marry her fast, before her pregnancy starts to show." Ruth cried all night. Her heart was shattered, but a small part of her understood that maybe her stepmother was only trying to do what she thought was best for Ella. Now that things had gone so wrong, Ruth couldn't stop blaming herself, wondering if maybe she should have paid closer attention to her sister. 2 weeks later, Henry and Ella had their wedding. Ruth felt like she was watching a bad dream that she couldn't escape. Ella moved fully into the matrimonial bedroom with Henry, and the two seemed happy together. Life went on, and Ella seemed to be enjoying her new life as Henry's wife. Henry treated her like gold, always doting on her and making sure she was comfortable. As Ella's pregnancy reached 8 months, Henry threw a huge party to celebrate. He was so proud that they had come this far, and he wanted everyone to join in the joy. Friends, family, and neighbors gathered, filling the house with laughter and excitement. Ella's mother was thrilled, her eyes sparkling with happiness for her daughter. During the party, Ella excused herself to touch up her makeup. Her best friend, who had helped plan the celebration, went with her. They went into the bedroom, laughing and chatting. Ella walked up to the mirror to check her lipstick, fixing her hair as she looked at her reflection. Her friend noticed the mirror and wrinkled her nose. "Ella," she said, "is this Henry's mirror? I think it's kind of ugly, especially with those gold designs around it. This doesn't look like your style at all." Ella laughed and shrugged. "I think it's ugly too, but it's always been here since I moved in. Maybe it's special to Henry. I was thinking of moving it to my room and putting my own mirror here." Her friend grinned. "Well, let me help you move it now." She went to grab the mirror, still chatting and laughing with Ella. But as she tried to lift it, something strange happened. Her fingers slipped, and with a loud crash, the mirror fell to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. For a moment, the room was silent, and the two friends stared at the broken glass scattered across the floor. In the living room, everyone was laughing and having a good time. But then, all of a sudden, Ella's mother let out a scream. "No!" Her voice was so loud and filled with fear that it made everyone stop. She jumped up and rushed into the bedroom where the mirror was broken. Henry and all the guests followed, confused and worried. When they got to the bedroom, they saw the mirror shattered into tiny pieces on the floor. Ella's mother dropped to her knees right next to the broken glass and started crying, "I'm finished. I am finished." Her cries were so loud, and she looked truly scared. Everyone in the room was puzzled and kept asking, "What's wrong? Why are you so upset over a broken mirror?" Ella felt embarrassed and tried to calm her mother down. "Mom, please stop embarrassing me. It's just a mirror. We can get a new one." But Ella's mother shook her head and shouted, "No! This is not just a mirror. This mirror is my life." Everyone was shocked, and they looked at her with wide eyes. They had never seen her act this way before. She took a deep breath, her face pale with fear, and began to speak. "I have to confess, I gave this mirror to Ruth, my stepdaughter, on her wedding day. But it wasn't a gift of love. I gave it to her to secretly watch her, to control her, and to ruin her life." The guests gasped, unable to believe what they were hearing. Ella's mother went on. "From the moment I met Ruth's father, I knew he would only marry me if I promised to love Ruth like my own daughter. But I never truly loved her. I was jealous of her. She took too much of his attention, and he loved her deeply. Even after I had Ella, he treated Ruth better. I pretended to love Ruth so my husband wouldn't know the truth. But deep inside I was filled with hate." She paused, her eyes filled with regret. "After Ruth's father passed away, I kept up the act, pretending to be the loving stepmother. But I secretly wanted her life to be miserable. I wanted her to fail, to suffer. When Ruth found Henry and brought him home, it made me even angrier. Ruth was happy, she was successful, and my own daughter, Ella, was struggling. I couldn't bear it." Everyone stared, too stunned to speak. She continued, "So I went to a native doctor. He gave me this mirror, a magical mirror. He told me to place it in Ruth's room. This mirror would allow us to see into her life, to know her every move. Every time she got pregnant, we used the mirror to cast spells to make her lose her baby. We even made her husband start to hate her. But there was one condition. The mirror must never, ever be broken. That's why I am finished." Tears streamed down her face as she looked around the room. I am so sorry for everything I did to Ruth. I was wrong. My jealousy ruined my life." Just as she finished, a strange look came over her face. She began to pull at her clothes, looking lost and confused. She stood up, looking around as if she didn't know where she was, then suddenly ran out of the house, out of the gate, and disappeared into the street. It was like she had lost her mind. As Henry and the guests rushed outside the house, they were all looking around, trying to see where Ella's mother had run off to. But then something surprising happened. Henry's gate man walked over, looking nervous and scared. He knelt down in front of Henry, his hands shaking. "Olga, I can't keep quiet anymore. I have to confess," the gate man said in a trembling voice. Everyone turned to him, confused. He took a deep breath and looked up at Henry. "Ella's baby. It's mine. I've been sleeping with her, and when she got pregnant, we made a plan. She would seduce you and make you think the baby was yours because I knew I couldn't take care of it. I'm sorry, sir, but I want my baby." Gasps filled the air. People couldn't believe what they were hearing. Ella fell to the ground, crying and begged for forgiveness, her face wet with tears. Henry was speechless. His face turned red with anger and hurt. He couldn't take it anymore. He quickly got into his car and drove off. The guests, feeling awkward and uncomfortable, slowly left, each one heading to their own home, leaving the place silent and empty. Henry drove straight to Ruth's house, his mind racing with guilt. When he arrived, he found Ruth lying on the floor in the living room, her eyes closed, holding her Bible as she prayed. She was asking for peace and strength, unaware that Henry was watching her with tear-filled eyes. Henry slowly knelt beside her, his head bowed. When Ruth looked up, she was surprised to see him there. "Ruth, I'm so sorry," he whispered. He told her everything. The truth about her stepmom, Ella, the gate man, the lies, and the heartbreak. As he spoke, both of them cried, the weight of everything heavy on their hearts. Henry begged her to forgive him, saying he wanted to make things right and heal together. Ruth, with tears in her eyes, saw the pain in Henry's heart and slowly forgave him. They hugged each other tightly and shared a tender kiss, promising to start fresh. Ruth packed her things and together they drove back to Henry's house, hoping to start a new chapter. But when they arrived, the house was empty. Ella was gone, the guests were gone, and even the gate man was nowhere to be found. It was as if they had all vanished. Ruth tried calling Ella, but her phone was off, and no one knew where she had gone. 2 months later, Ruth and Henry decided to leave everything behind. They moved to America, ready to begin a new life. Months passed, and one day Ruth discovered she was expecting. Henry was overjoyed, and both were filled with happiness and hope. This time, everything went smoothly. Ruth carried her baby safely, and when the time came, she gave birth to healthy twins, a beautiful boy and girl. The couple finally had their happy ending, filling their new home with love and laughter. Thank you for watching. Please, kindly subscribe to this channel. I need your support. To keep this channel growing and going, a subscription from you will go a long way. We post folktale stories regularly. Thanks so much as you subscribe. Peace.